Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. Dill, I think a fascinating week one matchup. Virginia Tech, South Carolina, Mercedes-Benz Stadium, Sunday afternoon. Many of the South Carolina fans probably know this already. I've been very vocal about my optimism around this football team going into 2025. What's so unique about this football game is the glaring question that I think a lot of South Carolina fans have about this football team in 2025 is going to be front and center in this matchup. You lose a lot of guys in the middle of that defensive line. You lose a lot of guys in that off-ball linebacker room. This is a Virginia Tech team that wants to run the football and has one of the more dynamic quarterbacks when healthy in Kyron Jones that can help them do that. The big question mark about South Carolina rolling into 2025 is, do they have enough specifically in the middle of that defensive line to hold up against teams that want to run the football right at them? We're going to find out real quick in this football game. And then you look at Virginia Tech and say, Dill, it's like a stark opposite of how we talked about this team 12 months ago. 12 months ago, rolling into 2024, this was, I believe, a top 5 team in returning production heading into 2024. Now they're sitting at 77th and have a ton of names on both sides of the football that they have to replace. I think it starts with one of the best running backs we saw in the country, and Bayshell Tootin last year. You lose 4 of your top pass catchers. You're shuffling the offensive line in a big-time way. A lot of new faces coming into this program. You have to replace Sneaky, one of the best edge rushers we saw in the country last year. A lot of names you have to replace in the secondary. It's really hard to kind of predict what this Virginia Tech team is going to look like. But when you have a quarterback that when he's playing his best football and Kyron Jones is extremely difficult to deal with, you have a chance to win a lot of football games. And Dill, I'd even go back to the 2024 year. It was a disappointing year for Virginia Tech. There's no way around that. I was sky high on this team 12 months ago. They went 6-7. Dill, they only had one game that they lost by more than one score. A lot of overtime losses, a lot of one-score losses. This was a much better team than we kind of see on paper. Can they play good football in 2025, but can they get it done in close games is probably the question a lot of Virginia Tech fans are asking. I'm fired up to get into this one. Before we do, and as always, Virginia Tech fans, South Carolina fans, let it fly in the comments section. A lot of different takes you can have about this football game. And the beauty of doing it in the dog days of summer, the only ones listening to this are the fans that live and breathe these programs. And chances are y'all got some takes. Let it rip. Appreciate you guys. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Dill, without further ado, I want to start with this Virginia Tech offense that I think the biggest question we both have is this is a brand new offensive line. You're not really sure what you're going to have at tackle, and you are going up against one of, if not the best, edge rushers in all of college football, and Dylan Stewart. That's probably where you have to start this conversation.
And it's a defensive line that plays really fast and really aggressive. And that's probably the hard part about dealing with is they want to create TFLs. They're not like in old school Alabama 2-gapping defensive line. Like they are in gaps. They're very aggressive. And that's hard probably to deal with for new offensive lines that are still gelling because that's how South Carolina is going to play. And again, you certainly wonder, do they have those guys on the inside to do what TJ Sanders was doing or do what Tonk Hemingway was doing? But you got it on the edge. They're going to create a lot of negative plays, or at least we certainly think so with Dylan Stewart, Brian Thomas, and company. But I still think this will be an interesting game for South Carolina to show that interior defensive line is kind of ready to be disrupted.
Well, because that's if you are, new offensive coordinator Philip Montgomery, you want to run the football in this game. Like you do not want to live in these 3rd and long situations with some new offensive tackles going up against a guy like Dylan Stewart or Brian Thomas, because we think that's some of the better edge rusher duos that you see in the country. Can you run the football? Can you stay on schedule? Can you avoid those 2nd and 3rd and long obvious passing situations? But then, Dill, the other conversation is you have to try to keep Kyron Jones in the pocket. And so it's going to be an interesting conversation where does South Carolina really want to ask Dylan Stewart to pin his ears back and go get after a guy like Kyron Jones when you're running the risk of Kyron Jones getting outside the pocket and doing some real damage, because that's probably where he's at his best. It takes me back to that Miami Hurricanes Virginia Tech game that we saw on a Friday night in September where, look, Miami was pinning the ears back. and trying to get after Kyron Jones, and they were creating a lot of havoc. But at the same time, Kyron Jones was getting outside the pocket and hurting Miami in a big-time way. For South Carolina, Dill, you're probably looking at these off-ball linebackers and saying, hey, quarterback spies, run and chase. Can South Carolina's linebackers do that in this football game is probably another massive question you have heading into this one.
And honestly, that might be where you feel good about what South Carolina has. Because I think you have questions about, like, are they physical enough to play really heavy run teams? Is Fred Johnson be a guy who take on fullbacks in the hole or take on pulling offensive guards in the hole? Like, that's certainly a question out there, but you don't really have any question about him playing in space and being able to chase guys down and be that type of style. So I look, that matchup's probably okay for South Carolina because that does play into their strengths. And I don't know that Virginia Tech has the physicality to just kind of blow them off.
And I wonder if you see Virginia Tech try to attack these linebackers. And like we've said all offseason for South Carolina, I love the athletic profiles that South Carolina has in that off-ball linebacker room. The only question is that none of them have played a ton of football. So you're going to see some misdirection. You're going to see Kyron Jones in some design quarterback runs. Can we have the eye discipline to fit the run and handle a lot of moving parts in this rushing attack for Virginia Tech? Because when you have a quarterback like Kyron Jones, you can throw a lot of different stuff at you in the run game. Are these linebackers up for the task?
Well, and that'll be an interesting thing too for Virginia Tech is obviously they're replacing their outgoing offensive coordinator with Philip Montgomery. And now can he dial it up the way they were doing it last year? Because I thought, like, again, you harken back to that Miami game, you go to that Duke game, like they did a really good job of getting to the boundary on teams, getting outside these linebackers and making plays off of that type of stuff. Now, has Philip Montgomery kind of run a similar scheme? Because that's probably where I think Virginia Tech needs to lean into again, because I just don't see them being able to be good enough in the middle of the defensive line to kind of play a more straight up game.
Here's the last question I have for this matchup. Can these Virginia Tech wide receivers reach their potential? You lose a lot of pass catchers from last year. Dill, we had the same conversation last year for Virginia Tech. Those wide receivers on paper, like this could be a sneaky good wide receiver room, and it never really kind of manifested itself on the football field. Donovan Green from Wake Forest. As a Wake Forest alum that's watched a lot of Wake Forest, but this kid can play. He's a tremendous athlete, but never really put it together and stayed healthy on the field. Cam Seldon, transfer from Tennessee. Really, really talented kid that, again, hasn't necessarily putting it together. You have Aiden Green, who I think can be a stud for Virginia Tech. That's going to be another interesting matchup because it's good on good. I think Virginia Tech has some wide receivers that can win, but I think South Carolina's got a really good secondary as well. Who wins that matchup? Probably another storyline you're following. Flipping sides here, Dill. South Carolina on offense. The big storyline for me is South Carolina was so good at manufacturing explosive plays last year. It wasn't always the most efficient and consistent offense in the 2024 year, but man, could they find explosive plays to go out and win football games. Virginia Tech, especially in the secondary, they only gave up a 54% completion percentage last year. That was sixth best in the country. But they did give up 7 yards per pass attempt, which was outside of the top 50. Gave up some explosives. South Carolina's really good at finding explosive plays. Virginia Tech gave some up at some bad times last year. It's a brand new secondary for Virginia Tech. A lot of new faces in this unit with the new defensive coordinator. That's probably where I'm looking at the most is, hey, can South Carolina get back to what they were doing in 2024 and find those plays working vertically down the field?
See, I kind of feel like that. I feel good about South Carolina being able to make that happen. To me, the much bigger question is, can they just play a more rhythmic style of offense throwing the ball? Like, I look at that Illinois game, like, I mean, there's too many game plays that I think they're leaving on the table. Like, when you want to win that type of game, like, LaNorris Sellers just needs to be more consistent in kind of the easy stuff because he's so good at making plays, so good at he throws a pretty good deep ball, I'd say.
Throws a great deep ball. Oh, my God. Graded out.
Better, like, again, if there's a 3rd and 6 and you have an open crosser, you can't throw it 2 yards behind. That needs to be.
Look, I'll say this. I think that gets a little overblown. I think LaNorris Sellers.
I don't know about that.
I think LaNorris Sellers struggled with that early in the season. I think a lot of that had to do with, like, this offensive line was a disaster early. I thought you saw him, and I'm not saying he doesn't have development in that area, because that's kind of where, if you see that consistently from LaNorris Sellers, like doing the easy stuff at a high level, you're you're looking at a guy
See,
that's going to be
that bowl game is the one I look at, like, where the rushing attack wasn't exactly there because you didn't have Rocket Sanders. You need to be able to make some of those throws that they left out there because they were
agreed.
there. I think they have good
Yeah.
enough playmakers.
And
That'll
I'm
be
not,
another certainly interesting one is what do these young players, especially at the wide receiver spot, look like. But that passing attack just needs to have more of a consistent feel to it. It didn't always have it last year. It kind of felt like it came in spurts and you'd hit big plays, but just game
yes,
in, game
agreed.
out, down and down out, that passing
That,
attack, you just want to see it look.
that's how South Carolina like takes that next step on offense. It was a good offense last year because they were so good at finding explosives, and those explosive plays aren't going to go anywhere. When you have a guy like Nick Harbor working vertically down the field, when you have a guy like LaNorris Sellers, this offense is going to be explosive. Ain't no question about that. That next level is, hey, the easy stuff, staying on schedule, being more efficient. Who replaces Josh Simon? Is you talk about efficiency, like that was LaNorris Sellers' guy. When it was time to go move the chains on a 3rd and 4, the ball was going to Josh Simon. In these big moments in this football game, who's it going to be? You know, there's some young pass catch, a guy like Mike Smith coming in at tight end, who I think is extremely gifted. Can he be the reliable presence that Josh Simon was for South Carolina last year? Last one I'll throw out there, turnovers. Virginia Tech was very good. And Brent, we know what Brent Pry can do on defense. They forced 2 turnovers per game last year, top 20 in the country. You saw at times, and LaNorris Sellers cleaned it up in the month of November, but early in the season, you saw a lot of turnover-worthy plays from him. Can you play a clean football game? Because that's kind of I think South Carolina's probably got a team you trust more talented football team. If Virginia Tech gives South Carolina some problems, it's probably coming off some of the turnovers that this Virginia Tech defense can force. Let's get into the pick. 9.5 points, neutral site, Dill. I'll give you the T-box first. Who you got?
Probably lean South Carolina. I think it's gonna be hard for Virginia Tech to turn over in the way they're doing it. I mean, especially in like the secondary in spots where they were really good, being able to take the ball away, having some really good pass rushers who aren't no longer there. Like what was working for them really effectively, especially on defense. I don't know that they have it this year. And then on offense, like I just haven't really seen teams replays a whole offensive line and be particularly effective. It's
Yeah.
just really hard to do.
It for me, and I think you made 2 really good points early. This is a really difficult South Carolina defensive line to work against with the way they try to penetrate and get into the backfield. I know South Carolina doesn't exactly have the personnel they had last year, but they're going to play the same way. And like you said, with a brand new offensive line, I could see that causing some problems. And I think at the end of the day, Dill, I have more confidence in South Carolina because you got a decent amount of the dudes that were dudes last year are still going to be dudes that you have in 2025, where you look at Virginia Tech and say, there is so much novelty on this roster. And you kind of you're going to trust the team that you think's more talented and the team that is probably a little bit more primed to play early games more effective. Give me South Carolina to cover the number. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel, and we'll talk to y'all later.